Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Ivan and I was born and raised in Redmond, that is in close proximity to downtown Seattle during the 80s era. The expansive location of Redmond was highly forested in those days, but over the last 30 years the trees have been cleared away to make way for housing developments and business enterprises. Yet despite all these modifications and alterations, the area still boasts a uniquely small-town feel about it, and still possesses a warm, friendly ambience among all the residents who live here. Although much has indeed changed and appears to be seemingly unrecognisable to the Redmond that I once knew, growing up as a young boy, needless to say, all these years later, it is a very pleasant part of the world to still live, which I do. I was raised by my very strict parents, who were old enough to be my grandparents. It would seem that my mother battled to conceive in her younger years, and a couple of years before she entered the menopause, she miraculously discovered that she was actually pregnant with me. Even my mother's gynecologists were amazed by this unexpected twist of events, which was never ever anticipated, and to say that I was not planned for is an understatement, if ever there was one. The only way that I can actually describe my childhood is both challenging and tumultuous, as my authoritarian parents believed that children should be seen and never heard. They literally raised me with a very stiff upper lip, in a very disciplined, regimental and structured way. If I misbehaved in any way, my stern, no-nonsense father would give me a very severe lashing with a studded belt, and I remember there were times that I could barely sit down, it hurt that much. My uncompromising father would constantly be quoting the Bible verse, "He who spares the rod hates his own son." And for him it was a righteous confirmation from God that I should be frequently whipped. Let's just say it gave him a rite of passage to lash out at me whenever he chose, like a nasty vicious viper. And he'd always tell me a hard spanking was very good for the soul, and it wouldn't do me any harm. As a child growing up, I was so fearful of my father's belt that I always felt I had to walk on eggshells, lest I did anything wrong to warrant a good lashing, or at the very least a very bad scolding to put me firmly in my place. If I dared to steal a cookie from the larder or come down to dinner with my hair looking dishevelled, I'd get a huge beating for presenting myself at the table in such a disrespectful, inappropriate way. The only way I can describe it is like growing up in a very strict boarding school under the supervision of a cantankerous old draconian headmaster. This pretty much was what it was like growing up under the steely hawk eyes of my two controlling, pertinacious parents, who were, to put simply, as humorless as a headless chicken. I grew up in such a charmless, loveless, austere environment that was much more regimental, military and ordered, rather than loving, congenial and warm. I believe my childhood rarely influenced who I became as an adult, so I am now a very introvert, reticent and somewhat aloof man. I don't mean to be that way, but that is what my childhood made me become. I have always failed to express my emotions and inevitably have battled and struggled with contentious issues that arise that would inevitably cause discord, disharmony or division in my family, as I've always been so desperate to keep the peace under every circumstance. When I was old enough, I left home and began plodding away at a local bank in downtown Seattle to make a living, and not long after that I married and moved into a decent home in a green, leafy, attractive suburb in Redmond. It wasn't far from my parents' original home. In those days I was recognised by the bank for some of my innovative, pioneering, ingenious and inspirational ideas, and so I was promoted and soon earning a sizable income, which was very much appreciated by my wife, who loved splashing out on extravagances at every turn. My strange, rather peculiar story that I'm about to share with you and your listeners has literally changed my life miraculously, in ways that I would never have foreseen or envisaged at all, in what I can only say is a life-altering, transformative experience, from where I emerged from the confines of a solitary cocoon and literally metamorphosized into a butterfly. And I owe this change in my character to my very strange, bizarre encounter with what I now know to be a Bigfoot. In those days I had absolutely no idea what this incredulous, majestic and lofty creature actually was, and I pondered over what I'd seen for many years, keeping the secrets of my strange encounter locked up in my mind under bolt and key, until now, of course. It all began when my younger daughter Emma was being persuaded somewhat forcefully by my effusive wife to enter these beauty pageants around North America that offered incredible prizes like cars and tons of money. My eager wife became animated in her enthusiasm in dressing my little kid up to look just like a Barbie doll and much, much older than her natural age, and she was very young at the time. My daughter was plastered with layers of makeup and expensive costumes that were so provocative I actually felt like I wanted to throw up. It made me sick to my stomach and nauseous to see my little kid being exploited like this by my own wife. Yet, in my fearful dread of confrontation of every kind, I just bit my lip and held my tongue. Inside my heart I felt like a raging volcano that wanted to burst out its bubbly molten lava everywhere. But I suppressed it all and buried my feelings, much like a squirrel storing away its stash of acorns over the winter. I loved and adored my wife with every single breath of my being, but her obsession with dressing my daughter up like this was driving me crazy. When would it ever stop, I would wonder? She would spend copious amounts of money getting Emma's outfits fastidiously styled by professional up-and-coming designers, where no expense was ever spared. We're talking about thousands of dollars that was spent on this ridiculous, obscene and tasteless enterprise. I felt that I was torn between a rock and a hard place, because I was desirous to see my wife happy, of course, but seeing my daughter's hair layered up on her head with curls and locks in a very sophisticated grown-up hairstyle with lashings of thick makeup seemed almost reprehensible to me. If that wasn't bad enough, she was learning how to wiggle her tiny hips with swaggering, gyrating dance moves and pouting her lips in such a suggestive way that would quite frankly have even made a sailor blush. My daughter was learning very provocative, enticing dance moves from this teacher of hers, who was inspiring my daughter to dance like a stripper, and she was also taking singing lessons so that she could perform very well on stage and sing like a star in her baby voice. Emma seemed to naturally be enjoying and delighting in all the fuss and attention that she was receiving from my wife. But I just felt it was so unhealthy and unwholesome for a young girl of my daughter's age to be ensnared in such an artificial world where the focus was on looking good, as if nothing else in life mattered. It was not the kind of value system that I was desirous to instill in my daughter. I felt in my heart that this was teaching my daughter a warped kind of morality, because she was so much more than her outer appearance. She was my adorable little girl. I was naturally concerned that she would grow up to be a dolly bird, having multiple surgeries so that she could end up looking exactly like a Barbie doll in order to feel that she had any self-esteem or worth, and that idea was just abhorrent to me. I'm ashamed to say that I bit my lip and said nothing. I was always having these inward arguments, telling myself to man up and step up and put my foot down and tell my wife that this had to stop. But I just couldn't do it, because I have to admit I was spineless, cowardly and timorous. In those days my wife was unable to drive, and so it was up to me to ferry her all around North America on these crazy, frivolous little fanciful jaunts, where all the excessively expensive entry fees would make up all the prize money, so that you could invariably walk away with thousands of dollars if you were a winner, or even a car. I never wanted to be a member of the audience at these events, as those events were largely full of women, so I had to find ways to busy myself while all these crazy Showtime shenanigans were all going on. More often than not, I would visit local towns, go and see a movie, or ride on my bicycle, which I always brought along with me to various beauty pageants. The worst part of these events was the pitiful, downcast, disheartened expressions on my daughter and wife's face after an event. "It's absolutely disgusting," my wife would say. "Emma was by far the most beautiful girl there, but she didn't get a look in from those prejudiced judges. There's something nefarious going on, because the judges are always picking the same girls every time at every beauty pageant. It never changes. Anyone could see that Emma was by far the best." "I didn't win, Daddy," my little girl would cry. "The judges think the other girls are prettier than me." "Well, the judges were wrong," I said. I would assure my girl that she was very pretty, and she was Daddy's very special girl. "Never again," my wife would say. "I'll be damned if I'm going to be exploited by a bunch of partisan judges who are probably receiving backhanders as I speak to promote the very same girls over and over again. It's a highly nefarious operation, and those judges are as crooked as bent trees. I don't trust them at all." I kid you not, 3 days after that bold, startling confession from my wife, she was once again enrolling Emma into yet another competition. It was like she'd become a hamster on a spinning wheel that just couldn't stop spinning around and round on this roller coaster of intrigue and bizarre, unhealthy addiction to beauty pageants. My startling story begins when I actually dropped my wife and daughter off at the local beauty pageant in Kentucky, where the winnings were extremely attractive, from a flashy car to thousands of dollars to be won in prize money. I decided to take my bike for a long ride in a countrified area that was surrounded by a vast expanse of natural woodland. There was a particular wooded area that had got my attention because it looked so statuesque and imposing, with towering trees that stood up straight in the heavens like long vertical giants. I knew these trees were hundreds of years old, and I loved their gnarled roots and the huge trunks that were covered in layers of green Spanish moss. I couldn't help but run my hands across the bark in rapturous awe, because I knew these incredible tours de force of nature had indeed eclipsed my existence by many lifetimes. I entered the woods, and for a moment my thoughts were transferred to the mystical beauty of this breathtaking place, which became even more awe-inspiring and alluring as I discovered a glorious gushing stream with a vigorous current meandering through the woods, and the sounds of the water, along with the chirping and the warbles of birds, was very enchanting. The gurgling stream was surrounded by lots of rocky outcrops, and I found one rock that was shaped like a king's throne and was very close to the water, where I chose to sit down. I unravelled my turkey sandwich, because I had begun to get rather hungry, that I had brought at the local town, along with a bottle of lemonade, and proceeded to eat and drink. I started to feel tired and sleepy, and before long I'd actually drifted into a deep sleep, with my upper torso pressing comfortably against the rocky headstone. I was suddenly awoken to this terrible whimpering sound that sounded like an animal or human was in distress. It was a cry of someone in dreadful, excruciating pain, and it was a sound I shan't forget in a hurry. I woke with a start and listened intently. The painful cries continued for a long time, with this intensive chattering sound that sounded rather like two people speaking gibberish in a very earnest tone. I peered over the side of the rock where I'd been sleeping, and then I saw them. There were 3 of them. One that was clearly the alpha male, and then there was a female and a younger one. But what on earth were they? I could hardly imagine. I was so stunned by what I was seeing, almost as if I'd actually seriously been shocked by a taser gun. That's how disorientated I felt. I'd never seen giant creatures like this before, as these critters were monstrously big in their girth, width and stature, and the male was easily over 10 foot tall, and that's without exaggeration. They were built like army tanks, with powerful, sinewy, muscular definition, especially noticeable on the shoulder area and the biceps. I observed that they were covered in the very dark, flowing brown hair, with heads that were shaped like bullets, that seamlessly just folded into the shoulders without really much evidence of a neck. If there was one, I didn't see it. It was what they were doing that actually got my attention. The little critter that was only 5 foot tall seemed to be holding his jaw with his hands and whimpering. I could tell that the poor thing was clearly in agonizing pain, especially judging by the swelling in his jaw. I suspected he might have an abscess on his tooth or an infection. His two very concerned parents were trying to reach out to the poor little critter to help him as much as they could. But if their hands got close to his inflamed, angry jaw, he would push them away with his overlong arm, whimpering loudly and protesting indignantly. The parents began to chatter away in a strange gibberish language, backwards and forwards to each other, and I knew they were arguing about what course of action should be taken for their child. I watched the child moving his body backwards and forwards in agitation as he clutched his jaw tightly and continued to whimper. Suddenly the male had seemingly had quite enough of all this whimpering, and he let out a thunderous growl that was so terrifying that I nearly jumped out of my skin, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. This alpha male curled back his lips to reveal his very large teeth, and he directed this angry growl towards the little critter. The vicious growl seemed to subdue the young critter somewhat, who immediately stopped whimpering. The male pounded his chest with his fists in what I imagine was a display of dominance, in an indignant way, as if he was asserting his authority towards his youngling and telling him who was boss. He then said something to the little critter in that gibberish language, who with troubled, frightened eyes obediently opened his mouth and jaw for his father to inspect. And this time he put up no resistance at all. The male critter was examining his youngling's jaw very intently, and when he found the inflamed area, he proceeded to pull out the offending tooth with his large, rather sausage-sized finger that you would have expected would be rather a clumsy instrument to use for tooth removal. But to my absolute amazement, he extracted the tooth rather effortlessly, which must have been down to his superhuman strength. Finally, he handed it to the young critter, who was studying it excitedly and jumping up and down for joy on his long, powerful legs, with his tooth in his hands, which he displayed proudly. He was acting like someone who'd won the lottery. He was over the moon about his tooth, and he kept showing it over and over again to his parents, in absolute delight. It was clear that the pain had gone, but immediately after the extraction, the mother handed her sprog some leaves to chew, which I imagine must have possessed some anti-inflammatory properties, because these creatures obviously know how to take care of their own. Suddenly the whole family seemed so much happier, and then I watched them glide off into the forest with what I can only describe was a seamless grace. The first words that came out of my mouth were, "What the heck was that?" I couldn't fathom or understand what these critters actually were, but they had taught me a valuable lesson in that extraordinary, rather surreal moment. The moment the male asserted his authority towards the youngling, and even the female critter, that was when my lesson was actually birthed, and when my eyes were finally opened to my responsibility and duty as a loving husband and protective father. I knew now what needed to be done. I had come into the woods as one man, and I was leaving as another. When the male critter demanded the youngling open its mouth, and it had obeyed immediately, and the problem was dealt with, and everybody was happy, I knew in that instant it was about time that I grew a backbone and started asserting a little authority around my own household, because this ridiculous desire to dress my kid up to look like a Barbie doll and so much older than she naturally was, had gone on long enough, and it was about time that it stopped. Later that day, as would be expected, both my wife and daughter returned to the car with very downcast, disheartened and disenchanted faces. "It's happened again," said my wife, slamming the car door angrily behind her as she got into the seat beside me. "Once again the judges were so biased, and they picked the same girls all over again. I'm telling you they're receiving backhanders. I know they are. Emma should have won. She's without question the most talented and the most beautiful of all the girls there." "All right," I said, raising my voice to a tone a little lower than a shout. "No daughter of mine is going to take part in a circus like this. And our daughter deserves a decent childhood, not being paraded around like a circus animal. You should be ashamed of yourself, Fiona, treating our daughter like a slice of eye candy to be exploited. Making our daughter look like she's an adult with all this makeup on is absolutely ridiculous. It's like you're playing dolls with our kid. Have you for a minute considered the long-term ramifications of what you're doing to our child?" Finally, it would seem that the volcano had actually erupted, and there was a startled silence in the car, and my wife looked at me with an expression of utter amazement on her face. But nobody said a word. The surprising thing is that never again did my daughter get involved in those crazy contests, because my wife listened to me. She respected my decision, and even years later admitted that it was a wise decision as far as my daughter was concerned, for her to enjoy a normal childhood. These days I'm still introverted, but I do my very best to express my love to my family in ways that my parents failed with me. I force myself to show that affection and love to my family that goes way beyond my comfort zone. When things get out of control, I'm no longer afraid to express my indignation, and that is thanks to the male Bigfoot that showed me the importance of being assertive as man of the household. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Beryl, and my very curious and strange story happened to me in the summer of 2012, when I was a young 18-year-old girl at the time, and the strange, seemingly supernatural course of events was so extraordinarily startling and outer-worldly that I never ever told anyone about my peculiar story. Because unless you've experienced something like this for yourself, it would seem way too incredulous and far-fetched to ever believe. In short, I emphatically believe I actually went to a parallel universe through an open portal in the woods that ultimately also led to a curious encounter with the hairy man himself. I unequivocally believe that the hairy man knows how to access these portals, which might explain why people have seen the critter vanish and dematerialise in front of their very eyes like a ghost. It could also explain why some people go missing every year, never to be seen or heard from again. I believe it's highly possible that they might have accidentally entered a portal or ended up in a parallel universe, much like I did. Perhaps they failed to return to our reality, or possibly even if they could have returned, they chose to stay in that parallel universe. For those who have returned from such bizarre experiences, like myself, I doubt they're talking about their story, as certainly I wasn't. But this anonymous forum enables me to tell my story without fear of ridicule, and it really feels good to tell people about these things. And if they choose not to believe my story, it really doesn't matter. I just want to put it out there. I'm the first to comprehend why my story might seem implausible to you. And if I heard the story myself that I'm about to share with you, the cynic within me would doubt every single word of it. But I ask you to open your eyes for a moment, and your mind, when you do hear the story that I'm about to tell you, and consider for a second that our world is much like an onion with many, many layers. And could it be possible that there are many realities beyond our own? And would it not be arrogant and short-sighted of us to believe and assume that this world is all there is? I was born and raised in Kentucky, here in North America, and I grew up on a beautiful farm in a rather attractive 1950s farmhouse with whitewashed walls, a grey slate roof and large French windows that overlooked some incredibly ravishing views of emerald green pasture land, rolling hills, mountainous valleys, rocky outcrops, a couple of ponds, and an exquisitely beautiful stream that zigzagged and meandered through a vast wooded area on our land that was a haven for all kinds of indigenous wildlife. We raised horses, cows, pigs and chickens, as well as growing all our own vegetables and selling some of the produce at the farmer's market. My mother also made jams, preserves and cakes to sell. I grew up in this farmhouse with my brother Tyson and my sister Amelia, both who were completely bananas and obsessed over horses. And when I say obsessed, I mean they literally lived, breathed and dreamt about horses every waking moment, night and day. I remember they entered and won horse riding competitions all over North America, and their bedrooms were strewn with the colourful paraphernalia such as rosettes and cups from all of their winnings. While I adored horses and all animals for that matter, I was not keen on horse riding at all, and so my siblings and I had very little in common in that regard. I did, however, enjoy getting my hands dirty and helping my father on the farm attend to the animals with odd jobs like mucking out the stables or feeding the chicken and pigs. I would also help her frost a long series of chocolate cakes that she intended to sell, as well as surreptitiously squirrel away a portion of chocolate cake for myself, which I very intentionally always accidentally broke apart, so that it simply couldn't be sold and needed to be eaten. In my spare time, I just loved to go for walking in the woods with my two dogs, Rufus and Salamander, who were two big cuddly mutts that were a mixture of collie, Labrador and Irish wolfhound, and they were rambunctious and energetic, with very lovable natures, always eager to please and willing to do my bidding. They simply adored their walks in the woods with me, and would boisterously go splashing around in the stream, wagging their tails vigorously as they dashed in and out of the water. Our woods were in pristine condition, as my dad managed them superbly, so that the mature trees had grown into statuesque giants that glided up vertically into the sky with colossal heads of lush green bushy foliage. There were clear trails in the woods, and the undergrowth consisted of ferns, ivies and some flowering creepers. I loved how serene and relaxed the woods made me feel. It was like a world within a world, and it was a blissful retreat where I felt I could be one with my thoughts, and of course with the natural world. If you've ever wondered why hunters enjoy spending so much time in the woods, I'd hasten to bet that if they're being really honest with you, they'll admit to you that the woods actually help them to unwind and relax, as wooded areas have remarkable rejuvenating and restorative properties on your conscious and unconscious mind. I guess the gurus would call it meditation, but whatever it is, it's a magical experience, believe me. My story begins when one day I was walking in the woods with my two dogs, who were running beside me, wagging their tails furiously. As I entered the woods, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, because I knew I was in a rejuvenating, restorative place that would make me feel truly contented. I had just had a very rough day, as I'd fallen out with my boyfriend, whom I'd been dating for over 2 years, and the ugly cracks in our relationship were beginning to show. I was now realising that we needed to call it quits, because things were not working out between us. What was the point of trying to make something work, if it clearly wasn't? If something is broken, no matter how much you try to glue it together, invariably it'll fall apart sooner or later. I had seen that all too often in the physical world, when a precious vase of ours had broken, and my aggrieved mother would painstakingly put the pieces together again. I'd observed that the vase would never ever be quite the same again. It had lost its former radiance and glory. Sooner or later, the glue naturally came apart again, and my mother would try her level best to glue it back together again, while my father and I would tell her to just throw it away, get rid of it. "You cannot fix something that is broken," he would tell her. And that's what I felt about my current relationship with my boyfriend. It just couldn't be fixed, so why glue it together with false hopes and promises and dreams that would never be realised? Invariably it would all wear away, much like the glue that was precariously holding the hypothetical vase together, very, very flimsily. The sensible thing to do was to discard it and walk away to avoid any greater heartbreak. That was the sensible thing to do. As I was meditating on all these thoughts, I listened happily to the pretty bird song in the woods and noticed a couple of white-tailed deer that scampered away from me very quickly. I always adored their serene and gentle natures that made me feel so warm in the heart, especially at times when my frazzled nerves and emotional anxieties wore me down heavily, as they did indeed on this occasion, as I pondered on the hopeless state of my long-since-over relationship. As I walked into the woods, I suddenly got the very distinct impression that I was being watched. But as I looked around the immediate vicinity, I saw nothing there. So I told myself very firmly to stop being so silly and that I was imagining things. It was then that I observed something peculiarly strange. The only way that I can describe it to you was that it was like a prism of moving light that was shaped like a pyramid. It was the oddest yet most intriguing thing that I've ever seen, and the light was literally dancing and consisted of long bands of golds, pinks and blue and purple hues. But I was drawn to that light with a powerful magnetic urge, much like a bee to a honey pot, and I wanted nothing more than to be bathed by that light. I ran towards that light with an exuberant enthusiasm, and found myself being bathed in its glorious, magnificent, ethereal rays that were so warm and inviting, enveloping me with what I can only describe as a universal, unconditional love. It was unlike anything that I've ever experienced before, and it made me feel connected to every living thing on this earth, from the flowers to the trees to the skies. It was the strangest, most beautiful feeling. My dogs were barking at me hysterically as they watched me being basked in this phenomenal light. And that was when I saw the strangest creature stepping through the undergrowth and staring at me with a look of unadulterated horror on its face. In that second, I knew I was observing a Bigfoot. I was so startled to observe the critter because I was one of those cynics that doubted that Bigfoot even existed. I had frequented the woods all my life and never seen sight or sound of the creature before. In my scientific mind, I had believed that Bigfoots were fabricated creatures of fiction, but now here I was in the cold light of day, observing him for my very self. He seemed so alarmed seeing me bathed in these prisms of light, and I sensed his concern. The creature didn't frighten me at all because of his demeanour, even though it was clear he was indeed an apex predator. It would be like being in the presence of a lion that exhibits the gentle characteristics of a docile cat, and regards you with the same level of gentleness and kindness. To look at, he was terrifying, because his height, girth and weight were very impressive. He was easily over 8 foot tall, very sinewy, ripped and burly, with exceedingly overlong arms, huge biceps, and extraordinary big shoulders that were easily 4 foot wide in circumference. He was covered from head to toe in long hazelnut hair that was tangled and matted, but I did not notice, nor did I even observe, any foul odour emanating from the creature that is so often described in Bigfoot encounters. The creature possessed a conical-shaped head and an oval-shaped face that was so human-like in its appearance it was quite uncanny. But it was the worried expression on the creature's face that filled me with great anxiety. I sensed with concern that he was worried about me standing in the strange light. What was this light, I wondered? Why was he so concerned about me standing in it? I tried to leave the strange prism of light, but for some reason I appeared trapped in it and ensnared by it, and could not escape. The next thing I knew, the light around me whirled, much like a spinning wheel, for about 5 long minutes. But it wasn't an unpleasant experience. The only way that I can describe it to you is I felt as if I was standing in front of a very powerful fan, which very suddenly just stopped. In that second, I opened my eyes that I had closed very tightly during this experience, to find myself in a field of exquisitely beautiful yellow and white flowers, of the likes that I have never ever seen before. But the woods that I'd been walking in moments earlier had vanished from my sight. I pinched myself to check if I was indeed still alive, and hadn't just died and entered some heavenly realm. It would seem I was very physically alive, but where on earth was I? Where were the woods? Where were my dogs? Where was the mysterious Bigfoot that I observed only moments before? I felt disorientated and exceedingly confused, if not rather apprehensive, but I was also eager and intently focused on actually finding my bearings and to make my way back into the woods. I was to observe that the woods were nowhere in sight. It was like I was in an open prairie with a scattering of large, resplendent, very tall trees under a very blue firmament, and it was a very exquisitely beautiful day. I could hear the pretty bird song in the valley and the feel of the cool breeze blowing gently against my face. I walked towards one of the trees that was heavily laden with heavy fruit that looked much like a pear in its shape, but was of the colour of a black grape. I bit into the flesh, and it was absolutely delicious, unlike anything I've tasted before. It was like the flavour of a mango, with the texture and juiciness of a grape, and the sweet fruit was utterly addictive. I sat down under the tree, momently distracted, to eat my fill of this delicious fruit, when suddenly a little boy came running up to me. He looked like a normal boy, only the clothes he wore were remarkably different to what modern boys wear today. He was wearing a 3/4 length baggy pair of white pants, which was the texture of blue jeans, and a loose cotton blue long-sleeve shirt that was rolled up at the sleeves. "Who are you?" he asked me, looking surprised to see me. "I'm Beryl, and I'm from Kentucky in North America," I said. "Never heard of the place," said the boy. "How far is it from here?" "That's what I'd like to know," I said. "I think I might be lost." The boy looked surprised. "Why would you be lost?" he said. "Maybe you should follow me." I followed the boy towards this countrified-looking dwelling that was made from colourful stones in different shades of peach that shimmered under the sunlight like mother-of-pearl, and had been blended together so seamlessly that I couldn't even notice the joins. The roof was actually made of vertical beams from a grey material that looked rather like marble, and the house had large windows and a very big front door with an extended porch. As I entered the home, I noticed it smelt of beautiful fragrance that reminded me of fresh summer roses. "Mother," called the boy, "there's someone here who says she's lost." Oh dear, said the woman, rushing out of the kitchen. "Not again. Please, no." The lady had long red hair that was tied back in a pretty bun. She had Arctic blue eyes and the most porcelain, unblemished skin that I've ever seen. She was dressed in a long, pretty, flowing dress that rose above her ankles, and was cool yet very flattering and exceedingly pretty. As the woman looked at me, she asked me, "Are you from America?" My face lit up. "Yes," I said, "I'm from Kentucky. I need to go home, but I've lost my bearings." The woman giggled. "You've done more than lost your bearings, dear," she said. "You're in a very different reality, and this isn't the first time it's happened, and it's not the first time an American has entered this portal. I helped someone who passed through this way from your reality before. It must have been about 10 years ago. And after they spent some time here, they didn't want to return because they liked it here too much. We can't let that happen to you because you're meant to be in your reality and not this one, as everything is divinely orchestrated and you're simply just not meant to be here." "How are you going to get me back?" I asked. "I really need to go now. I'm worried about my dogs in the woods. They'll be wondering where I've got to." "Where are we now?" I asked. "This location is known as Wellinda. We're in the country of Meridonia, but I assure you that you'll know nothing of my world, because although similar to yours, it is indeed different. But I'm not sure whether the portal will be open. Come with me, because stranger things have happened before." I followed this kindly lady, and I'm ashamed to say I never even bothered to ask her name, because I was so desperate to get back to the woods from where I'd come, to my dogs, and also home. We walked around the back of her house, where I observed a stunningly exquisite silvery lake that was more mesmerising than any lake I've seen on earth. And there was a waterfowl there, rather like ducks that were paddling on the water, only they were remarkably different to ours. She took me to a mountainous ridge in the southerly section of her home, and then she gasped. "The portal's open," she said. "I can hardly believe it." Standing next to the open portal was the Bigfoot that I'd seen in the woods at my home, and he appeared to be waiting for me. "The Aragaya are here," she said. The woman walked straight up to the Bigfoot, and they both looked at each other, and she said absolutely nothing to him, but I could tell by their eye contact that they were indeed communicating with each other, on a telepathic level, and they had a very comfortable relationship together. It was as if she knew the Erogaya, or Bigfoot, very well. He's from the Erogaya tribe, she told me, a very ancient people, and he saw you today entering the portal, but was unable to stop you. He's here to take you back to your reality, so you're in good hands, she assured me. You can trust the Erogaya. Thank you very much, I said, giving the lady a big warm hug. I could see the pyramid-shaped prisms of light that had previously intoxicated me, and the Bigfoot and I entered the light, and then after a while it started whirling around like a spinning wheel, and then finally stopped. Suddenly there I was again, back in the forest, and my dogs were there, almost waiting for me. They licked me all over with so much excitement, as if I'd been gone for a while. Bigfoot watched me with a rather amused expression on his face as my animals welcomed me home. I believe they sensed that something outer-worldly had indeed happened to me, as their senses were so alerted and heightened, and they kept sniffing me and licking my body with a very curious intrigue, with the same kind of interest that you would expect to receive if you'd been in the presence of lots of other animals. They barely even acknowledged the Bigfoot, because their focus was entirely on me, and they just could not stop smelling me for at least half an hour. I nodded to the Bigfoot and watched him glide away, and I was so delighted to be back home in my own reality. Looking back now, my experience seems to be so surreal, so much so that I tell myself that I imagined it all, or daydreamed about it. Yet I remember it so clearly and so vividly as if it was yesterday, and it is unlike any dream. I only wish that while I'd been in that parallel universe, that I'd asked more questions. I felt like a fish out of water in that strange reality. I just wanted to be at home, surrounded by the calming familiarities of my own life, irrespective of how messed up they might actually be. I discovered when I did return home that my morning walk had not been much longer than usual, so how long I was in that alternative reality I won't ever really know. I remember when I entered my kitchen I saw my mother making jam, and I ran into her arms and hugged her tightly, telling her that I loved her so much. "I love you too, honey," she chuckled. "What's got into you today? You're so affectionate all of a sudden." I also wasted no time in phoning out my boyfriend and telling him that we couldn't fix our broken relationship, because in that moment I knew I wanted to live life fully and regret nothing. Do they not say that fortune favours the brave? So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Zachary, and my extraordinary, strange, peculiar and mysterious story occurred in the summer of 2011, when I was about 21 years old at the time, and it was seemingly so incredulous and outlandish that all these years later I have pondered and reflected about what on earth it was that I encountered on that fateful day. It would seem that the great secretive and unyielding waters of the deep exposed to me a creature of such astonishing intrigue, the likes of such that you would have only ever believed abounded in fairy tales, folklore, fables and legends. Stories that invariably go back for many generations, of notoriously dangerous sea monsters that roamed the waves of the high seas or the deep rivers, bringing down many an unsuspecting fishing boat or passing ship to its knees. Yet many of these survivors from these devastating sea tragedies in our history share their alarming accounts of wrestling with the monstrous tentacles of a giant octopus, such as the legendary Scandinavian kraken, or some other giant-like gruesome monster. Then there are the somewhat erroneous accounts of the long-necked Loch Ness monster in Scotland, of which there has been a phenomenal amount of sightings reported over the years. Not to mention the reported hazardous accounts on the high seas of sailors encountering mermaids, some that did not conform to our stereotypical beliefs of a beautiful woman with a tail, that might have been born from a sailor's wishful fantasies that bore no similarity to the real thing. It would seem that many of these humanoid fish-like beings were indeed hideously ugly and exceedingly treacherous, some that were desirous to cause hazardous shipwrecks, luring the men on board of those ships to their watery graves. Our oceans are as vast as they are indeed wide, and the sea is easily over 12,100 feet, with the deepest part of the ocean known as the Challenger Deep, which is located southwest of the United States, close to the island of Guam. Only a little light penetrates the oceans after about 200 meters, but the midnight zone exists at 3,280 feet and is bathed in darkness. So one can only imagine what strange creatures lurk in the secret depths of those waters that might just haunt your darkest, most terrifying nightmares. For many who have ventured on the ocean floor have described encounters with monstrous octopus and mermaid-like beings, and there are even those that say that the gates of hell lie at the murky depths of this ocean floor, and some believe that they've heard the sounds of heavy chains rattling and clanking, and the petrified screams of the damned. Before I expand on my story, let me tell you a little about myself. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and even though I use a wheelchair to get around, I assure you that in no way has it impeded me from getting the most out of my life, as I am an adventurous person with a huge passion for outdoor pursuits, and I adore fishing, hiking, travelling and camping. My strange, absurd and seemingly fictitious story occurred when my uncle and aunt came to visit our family from the Northwest, and naturally my parents wanted to extend them the very best kind of hospitality that they could. They also wanted to introduce them to some of the rich treasures that the Pacific Northwest naturally has to offer. As a family, we all went to stay at an exquisite location on the Oregon coast, overlooking the ravishing panoramic views of the stunning ocean, with its tumultuous high breakers, along with the soft white sea sand, not to mention the masterful rocky outcrops, sometimes in or outside the water, that looked like statuesque works of art, designed by Mother Nature herself. As a family, we were having a very enjoyable time at the Oregon coast, because it is indeed a spectacular part of the world that prides itself on its idyllic, very enviable, ravishing scenery. My uncle was desirous to experience a deep-sea excursion, and he fancied doing a spot of halibut fishing on the Oregon coast, and subsequently we hired a charter. Imagine our disappointment when our exciting fishing trip was cancelled due to bad weather. Invariably that happens from time to time, but I do remember feeling bitterly disheartened and despondent, because I had intended on being part of this exciting excursion, and I think you could sense that everybody was feeling more than just a little crestfallen. Luckily it was not long before our moods lifted considerably when we decided to change our itinerary and chose to go fishing at a place called Devil's Lake, which was situated in close proximity to where we were staying. Little did I comprehend that there really might be a spawn of the devil inhabiting that lake, and there could indeed be a hint of the truth to those spurious legends. The Devil's Lake has an extraordinary history all of its own. It is connected to the Dee River, which is the world's shortest lake, and there are many myths and legends about a monster that would take people from the lake to devour them. I gather that the locals in the area at the time did not desire to build residential developments close to the lake, as many implicitly believed that there was a monster dwelling in the depths of the river, hankering to dine out on human flesh. So at the crack of dawn, before the morning had broken, we packed my uncle's truck with all our fishing gear and headed towards Devil's Lake. I was feeling enthusiastic and excited, as I always enjoyed fishing, and I was hoping to catch a sizable fish. When we arrived at the silvery lake, it literally took my breath away, because it was a fisherman's dream. The vast expanse of water twinkled and sparkled in the morning sun, reflecting the tall statuesque evergreen trees that surrounded the lake, some on rocky elevations that swept back for quite a distance. It was such a beautiful day, with a still breeze blowing against my skin, and I was eager to begin fishing and to cast out my bait. The best news of all was that the whole area was incredibly tranquil and peaceful, without a human soul in sight, which meant that this spot of paradise was ours for the morning. All we could hear was the beautiful bird song in the valley. I've always adored birds, but my greatest fascination are birds of prey, like hawks and ospreys, that are the most spectacular hunters of all. And I would always marvel how they could dive into the water with effortless, meticulous precision and fly off with an impressive catch grasped in their talons, while in contrast, I was lucky to catch even a small sardine-sized fish. I was secretly hoping to spot a bald eagle, because although sightings are incredibly rare, You're more likely to observe one near a freshwater lake like this one in Oregon, so I was very determined to keep my eyes pinned to the skies for a potential spotting of this majestic, gracious, winged monarch of the skies. We did find a rather precarious fishing spot, which was a dock that seemed to float above the water, that didn't have any guardrails, but needless to say we decided that this would indeed be an adequate spot for our fishing. Once my pole was baited and my line cast in the water, my dad and my uncle went back to the truck to retrieve some chairs to make the fishing session ahead of us much more comfortable and to recover the cooler and other necessities that we would invariably need to enhance our enjoyment of this exciting expedition. So I was the one with a head start, and I was indeed hoping that for once I might just catch something big, and I felt perfectly content and secure being left alone on the fishing dock while my dad scurried off with his brother to get organised. I knew that they were in shouting range, as if I turned around I would see them busying themselves at the car and gathering all our belongings together, while they chatted away happily, discussing their chances of catching a sizable fish, which was the very thought that we all had surfing the waves of our mind that morning. What I am now going to convey to you may have only lasted a few seconds, but as is the case with any life-threatening situations, those seconds seem to last a lifetime for the victim in question, as your life flashes before you in these life and death screenplays. This is common in all kinds of accidents, without exception, and in this scenario it was invariably no different for me. It all happened while I was briefly scanning the skies for a pair of soaring majestic wings, but before I even had a chance to study the blue firmament more closely, my wheelchair had been jerked forward so violently, doing a 180-degree turn, which caused me to be flung haphazardly out of my chair onto the deck. It took me a while to comprehend what had occurred, as it was all curiously bizarre. I was still struggling to ascertain what in the world had just transpired, and to make some kind of sense of it all. It was exceedingly unsettling for me, as something like this had never transpired before. It suddenly dawned on me in a lightning-strike revelation that hit me hard like a thunderous bolt of electricity in the face, and that was that something or someone had intentionally attempted to drag my wheelchair into the water, but who or what it was, I could not even imagine. I can assure you that this was not a large fish, for if indeed that were the case, I would have been pulled straight in by my wheelchair, and this never happened. The next part of my story turns my blood icy cold and gives me goosebumps all over as I recall the horrendous events that unfolded before me, because it was so surreal you could have been forgiven for believing that this was a dream. Yet I assure you that this was not the case. Suddenly, to my horror, I felt a very firm pressure on my legs that felt like something was trying to grab hold of me, like a cold hand of some kind. I knew instinctively that whatever this thing was, its intentions were very nefarious towards me. I fought back as hard as I could, and there are no words to describe the terror I was feeling as my heart was pounding violently in my chest and my anxiety levels heightened as the creature pulled me backwards vigorously. With all the strength that I could muster, I crawled away, and once again I was yanked back by this creature with a determined force. I cried out in horror as tears of terror misted my eyes. With my hands I was eagerly looking for something to hold on to support my weight, but there was nothing on the dock that could have helped me in those vital seconds. In that poignant moment of time, there was no doubt in my mind that I was fighting for my life, and so I rolled on my back, and that was when I saw her. I will never forget those hauntingly sinister amber golden eyes with the inner rectangular pupil as long as I live. My eyes locked into hers, and she became incandescent with rage and hateful hostility that was so palpable I could physically sense her malevolent energy. This peculiar devilish creature was over 6 feet tall, with a mermaid-like tail covered in spiky barbs that was easily as large as her body, and she had very strong, powerful legs that ended in talons. Her whole body was a dull, mottled greenish-grey colour that seemed matched by the water of the lake, and it was covered with these spiky, tooth-like scales or barbs. The strange sea critter possessed strange, fresh, muscular appendages that moved like seaweed above her head, and she also possessed a feminine-like oval face. This hideous beast glared at me and growled aggressively as her blue lips pulled back to reveal a set of human-like teeth. I noticed she had a female nose with strange slits on either side that looked remarkably like gills. I also observed that tapering along the back of her neck and her spine were very defined, spiky, sharp-looking barbs, resembling that of a crocodile, only they were much more pointed and jagged. After the creature's eyes locked with mine, she pounced on my body with a powerful, alarming force and a malicious intent, and I was incredibly surprised that she hadn't pulled me into the water first to finish me off, which is, in my opinion, the obvious thing to have done. I want to assure you that this creature was incredibly intelligent and discerning, and of that I was in no doubt. It would seem she wanted to kill me on the land before dragging me back into the lake. Suddenly I began to feel a cold, stinging, painful, prickly, suction-like sensation at the back of my body, rather reminding me of a large jellyfish bite, but a whole lot worse and much more painful. She was holding me down so powerfully with her hefty arms, and both of her powerful legs were pinning me down on either side of my body. I was instinctively fighting back with all my might and with all my strength. I remember both my hands were fighting back in a defensive position, with one of my hands trying to push her forehead forcefully away from me, and my other hand pushed against her throat. I knew her intentions were to rip off my entire face, much like a crocodile with her hungry, powerful jaws. I was so terrified that tears were streaming down my face like heavy raindrops, and I began to scream at the top of my lungs in the desperate hope that my father would come to my rescue. Did they have any idea what was unveiling before them, only yards away from where they were parked? With luck it would appear that my uncle had indeed heard my petrified screams, and he came tearing from the car towards the fishing dock, where in utter horror he discovered me being attacked by this monstrous sea creature with its ugly mottled body wrapped around my defenceless form. Instinctively he began pounding the creature's face with his boots as hard as he possibly could. Moments later my father emerged, appalled by what he was seeing, and began striking and bludgeoning the creature forcefully with a fishing club, aiming his vital blows at the back of the critter's head and neck. I kid you not, that after the fifth strike the fishing club actually broke under the strain and exertion of hitting something seemingly with a robust, powerful resistance, as the skin on this creature was like a tough protective armour or hide, much like a crocodile, but much, much tougher. My dad noted that as he bashed this curious sea monster, he detected no bleeding or bruising, despite having lashed the creature with such a frenzied attack. I'm glad to inform you that the creature finally gave up the fight, and loosened her grip from me rather reluctantly, as I think she'd seen me on my wheelchair and thought that I would be easy pickings. We watched the creature finally slide back into the water like a crocodile, and finally hitting it with a hefty thud, and then, thankfully, it was gone from our sight. "What the heck?" said my uncle in horror. "Tell me what in God's name was that hideous thing?" "I have no clue," said my dad, "but never in my life have I seen anything quite like this before. But right now our priority is to get my son to the hospital to be checked out for his injuries." We packed up the truck and headed towards the hospital. I was crying with relief and horror at the same time at what had transpired. Things could have ended up so differently for me, and I was so glad to be alive and indebted to both my uncle and dad for rescuing me on that day. At the hospital I was treated for multiple lacerations and nasty open cuts caused by the scale-like barbs of this creature, where it had pressed its weight against my body, tearing my skin with its scaly barbs. My father told the doctor that my injuries were caused by an attack from a mountain lion, and I'm glad to say that even if the doctor did not believe our claims, he never said a word. I mean, how can you say that a sea monster attacked you? Would anybody have believed us? Somehow I doubt it. A decade has indeed passed since that strange event that still leaves me pondering about what it was that tried to kill me that day. I think it had observed me on the wheelchair alone on the deck, and thought I was a sitting duck and an easy meal waiting to be devoured. It possibly noticed me there all alone. I think and reflect on all the legends that abound about a monster in Devil's Lake, and I know without a doubt I encountered one that day, although what it was, I may never ever know. I was to discover that there is an Inuit legend of a creature called the Qualapalik from the Pacific Northwest that is a dangerous sea being that resembles a woman and dines out on human flesh. Could this creature of myth be real after all? And was this the creature that attacked me that day? I wish I knew the answer to that question. So there you are. That's my story. And now we come on to the next story after Zachary's. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I'm writing to tell you about a very strange experience I had on the Oregon coast in the summer of 2006, when I was 18 years old at the time, that had me pondering whether the legends of mermaids could indeed be real. But the creature that I observed that day was anything but beautiful, and they looked like creatures that had descended from the gates of hell itself, because there was nothing becoming or remotely attractive about these humanoid fish at all. My strange, curious story begins when we were doing a spot of deep-sea fishing in the Oregon coast, as we had booked a bareboat charter as a family. I live in Seattle, and every June we choose to vacation at the Oregon coast, as my Uncle William possesses a beautiful holiday home there, which he allows our extended family to use. It's one of those stunning houses situated on the Oregon coast, which overlooks the most panoramic and sensational views of the blue ocean. My family live and work in downtown Seattle, and we abide in a green, leafy suburb. As a close-knit, fun-loving family, we love nothing better than escaping to the coast, and my family is passionate about deep-sea fishing, which is something we do regularly on our visits to my uncle's seaside retreat. My dad finds deep-sea fishing a huge stress reliever, as his job as a defense attorney in downtown Seattle can be very taxing and demanding. Over the years, my dad has caught some massive-looking fish. Some photographs of his monstrosities hang pride of place on his office wall, and he's always been complimented by many of his clients on his colossal fish trophies. I think he secretly enjoys the fuss that the photographs create, because it's interesting to note that he's not so keen to hang those same pictures at home, as the audience of admirers would be significantly less. So I guess you could say my dad is a bit of a big head and a show-off and rather conceited about his fishing prowess. So on this seemingly beautiful summer's day, when the weather forecast predicted excellent weather, we were eager to charter our ship, and my mother, father, and my sister Pippa, and my brother Philip, and myself, of course, were keen to head out to sea. We were all hopeful to spot a school of bottlenose dolphins, porpoises, or killer whales, as encounters with these intelligent, awesome creatures are always so memorable for us, and on occasions the dolphins have interacted on the boat with us by doing some marvellous water aerobics for us to enjoy. My father had invited a couple of work colleagues to join us on our trip, a man called Tiny, which was uncanny because he was easily over 6 foot tall and far from small, and another man called Tim. For a while everything ran smoothly on board our boat, and my mother and I assembled a delicious lunch below deck, while the men fished and drank beer, and everybody was in high spirits. My dad had caught 2 or 3 fish, but these ones were medium in size. But considering the other men had failed to catch anything, I could tell by the twinkle in my dad's eyes that he was having a good time, and was indeed in top form. Before long we enjoyed a delicious lunch of chicken in blue cheese sauce with tagliatelle and salad, which everybody heartily enjoyed, and was washed down with glasses of sparkling white wine, and if that wasn't enough, it was followed by a rather rich dessert of pears and red wine with cinnamon ice cream, all that was very delicious indeed. Suddenly, like a bolt out of the blue, the water became very choppy, and the waves violently angry, as they pounded furiously against our boat. It was almost like a switch was flicked on, and the sky suddenly took on a menacing dark colour, and we could hear the distinct ominous rumble of thunder, and observe a jagged flash of lightning light up the sky like a firework. We knew that a freak storm was brewing, which had never been anticipated, and that we needed to make our way safely back. I suddenly became violently nauseous, as the choppy waters was causing the food in my stomach to thrash around my body like a spin dryer on full cycle. I leaned over the edge of the boat to throw up the contents of my stomach. Suddenly I sensed these sinister-looking eyes upon me, and that was when I saw them. There were dozens of these humanoid mermaids in the water, surrounding our ship. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I'd never seen anything like this before. They all looked feminine with long oval faces, but the spiny-looking skin on their bodies was a putrid mottled blue-green colour. They did have long dark human hair and bright yellow golden eyes. I observed that they had long green mermaid fish-like scaly bodies that were spiny, with large translucent fish-like tails. I immediately called everybody on board to see these mermaids, and everyone ran to observe them. On board our boat, everybody was so excited. My dad was saying, "What the heck?" My mother was saying mermaids, and everybody was gasping in awe. We couldn't believe what we were actually seeing. These mermaid-like beings greeted us with friendly waves and big fake smiles that exposed glistening white, human-like teeth. It would seem that they were not at all reticent, reserved, withdrawn or shy, as you would have expected. They appeared charming, friendly and welcoming. Yet in my gut I sensed these hideous sea creatures were anything but decent, and that their intentions towards us were not honourable. In the middle of this insidious, perilous storm that was brewing, these critters kept indicating with their hands for us to join them in the water for a swim. Were they mad or what? I sensed immediately that their motives were nefarious, because the energy that they exuded was menacing, and why on earth did they want us in the water? My family believes they wanted to eat us, and we were in no doubt that that was the case. To my amazement, Tiny, the large 6-foot man, was trying to get off the boat into the water with these creatures. My father was pulling him back violently. "What the hell, Tiny?" my father blurted out. "What the heck are you planning to do? You don't want to get into the water with those hideously ugly creatures. You're asking for trouble, mate." "They're so beautiful," said Tiny. "They're beautiful." "Who's beautiful?" asked my dad. "The mermaids, of course," said Tiny. I couldn't believe that Tiny was describing these creatures as beautiful. Had he seen what we had observed? The hideously grotesque blue-green mermaids, with their spiny heads and long black tangled hair, were anything but attractive. I was to find out later that Tiny believed these mermaids were exquisitely stunning, with long flowing golden hair, fair skin and blue eyes. Let me assure you that this is not what we perceived. I believe that Tiny was being mind-controlled in some way by these extraordinary creatures, so that he saw them in a seductive, alluring light that was so bewitching, manipulative, like a ruse that somehow was projected in his mind to get him to join them in the water. Maybe this is how sailors from the past were tempted by beautiful, seductive mermaids out at sea in bygone times, because they appeared beautiful, but were anything but. And then they were tricked into the water, unsuspectingly to their deaths, like a moth to a spider's web. After the creatures realised we weren't going to get into the water with them, they hissed at us like snakes and curled back their lips to unleash the most horrifying wailing sound that I've ever heard before, that sounded like the roar of a mighty, terrifying wind. I was petrified. Finally the creatures swam away and left us alone. We had indeed seen their true colours. I'm glad to say that the storm finally did subside, and we returned to shore safely and quickly. And my father instructed us never ever to speak of what we had observed. He believed that we would be ridiculed and discredited, but I figured that in this anonymous forum I could tell my story to you and your listeners, of a strange experience that has forced me to conclude that some of those legends out there may indeed be true. I personally believe these mermaids reveal themselves in stormy weathers, and in the past it possibly was easier to capsize a boat, but nowadays boats are much sturdier, more robust and seaworthy, so these insidiously evil creatures use their seductive powers and charms to try and woo us to get us to go into the water. Even today, Tiny describes those ugly mermaids as the most exquisite woman he has ever yet seen, and he is adamant about that. So there you are. That's my story. I just want to thank you so very much, Zachary, for your extraordinary, extraordinary story. And I also want to thank you, Hannah, for yours as well. And although I got these stories at very different times, and Zachary is one of my subscribers, I have to tell you that I thought that they were so incredibly connected in some way, because they have a similarity about them in regards to what these creatures' intentions were. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Max, and I have an extraordinary letter that was written by a lady called Emma, who was writing to her sister Eugenie in the days of coal mining in West Virginia in the 1800s. It would appear that Eugenie left the coal mining business to marry an affluent gentleman living in the Midwest. I have a feeling that Eugenie is an ancestor of mine, which is why I do have her sister's letter that she wrote to her, which I kept for many years as it was a huge source of fascination for me when I stumbled across it by random chance as a young boy. I kept it because in her letter she describes an extraordinary encounter with a mythical beast which I really believe was a Bigfoot. It would seem that Eugenie's father owned a coal mine, and she describes her revulsion at how the locals were actually treated by her own father. It would seem she had a compassionate heart, but felt disabled as a young woman at the time to have her voice heard in regards to helping right the dreadful wrongs and exploitations that the miners invariably experienced. Working in a coal mine was doing the hardest, most dangerous job in the entire world, which involved hauling coal and using dangerous explosives in the mine to bring down the coal, a mission that in its day was not without grievous risk. So here is her extraordinary letter that she wrote her sister Eugenie, which includes a Bigfoot encounter that leads her to the revelation that she cannot marry her suitor because she realizes he hasn't got a backbone at all. So here is the story. To my dearest, most beloved sister Eugenie. Eugenie, my sweet, precious, most beloved sister, how dreadfully missed you have been by all of us of late. Our home without doubt feels lost and forlorn without its precious songbird. It would seem that without your cheerful countenance, our mansion lacks the sunshine you always bring to our lives, something that has become painfully apparent to all of us, now that you have gone to pastures new. Oh, how I long to see you, Eugenie, my precious, most beloved sister. You indeed have my whole heart. Even Papa has less of a skip in his step these days, and as for Mamma, her face is forever downcast, and she speaks always of the hole in her heart now that you have gone away. I hope that your new life in the Midwest is indeed favouring you well, and that the barren landscape does not dishearten your spirit. Moreover, I hope that the treacherous summer heat has not been a hindrance to the preservation of your perfect pale complexion. I hope that your husband is treating you favourably in a manner of your worth, and that married life does become you. For my dear sweet Eugenie, you deserve the bounty of life's abundant treasures and the greatest happiness of its rich tapestry that it can bestow upon you. I hope in the days to come that we may hear word on the wind from the Midwest of the pitter-patter of tiny little feet soon to cross the threshold of your new sumptuous abode. I hold this hope in my heart like a bright beacon of light, that I may soon become an aunt in the foreseeable future, as such news would be warmly welcomed in my heart. Papa is still up to his old insidious tricks again at the coal mine. It's apparent that he cares not for the people nestled under his wings, nor does he take any responsibility for their sorry plight. He comprehends not the toilsome labours and arduous workloads of the miners, and is not aggrieved by the perils they face daily underground, especially when ceilings are low and accidents more likely to occur. The miners did demand of him an increased wage, and he agreed to this advancement. I hasten to say that so treacherous was Papa that he spiked the prices up in the company stores to make up for the shortfall of the wage increase. The miners are indeed no better off than they were before, and yet our Papa considers himself a virtuous man of God in this shameful, appalling exploitation of his workers. It is beyond reprehensible what he has done. Yet when I registered my misgivings about his devious actions and protested indignantly, he proceeded to tell me that I knew not the ways of business, and that my young brain was better served to focusing on the trivia of more feminine pursuits, and not to concern myself with the issues of the mine. How can I not be concerned, Eugenie dear? For when I look outside my luxurious balcony windows overlooking the mine, I see the young and old faces blackened by the coal dust and the sweat that beats upon their brows. I observe the long, arduous hours that they work, and the perilous risks they face. I also hear the rumbling of the mine every day, and the loud explosions from beneath the ground. And all of this I observe and see every day. How can my eyes be blinded by what I observe? For that would make me have the hide of a crocodile. I have taken it upon myself to visit the many households of the miners, as I want to express my empathy towards their plight, and show them that not all our family is ignorant of their sufferings. It is hard to fathom how these people of such pleasing countenance live in these small miners' cabins that are far from agreeable, and even my closet, Eugenie, is of greater width and depth than their own tiny houses. It unsettles me and disturbs me greatly to see a family of 8 squashed into such tiny living quarters. Many of them are in debt to Papa at the company store, and struggle to even put food on the table to feed their families. I so wish Papa could forgive their debts with all my heart, as it would be of no real bother to his pocket, yet for them the relief would be a blessing of note. Despite the grievous injustices the miners have invariably faced, not to mention their rising debt and expenses incurred at Papa's company store, these resilient folk still remain upbeat and positive, with an attitude of merriment and good humour, always spinning yarns and singing songs, especially down in the mines. I was to learn that the miners always joke and tell tales of devilish apparitions that they encounter in the hole. How can they be so jovial in spirit, give grievous evils that have befallen them? If it were indeed me, I would not be so generous of heart in my forgiveness of Papa. Yet these miners sing and dance and help each other in every regard, and treat their friends as family. I know they are indeed aggrieved by the struggles their daily lives proliferate, but they are still in good spirits, and the young men are forever taught to grin through the wretchedness of the mine, and shine like men in their countenance, despite the dreads they face, for each day hangs in the balance for them, and that is indeed truly the case. Let's not forget to mention the pitiful complications of the black coal dust that does indeed clog their lungs and cause a shallowness of breath, for many have died in this regard, a manner of death that I would not wish on anyone. Yet still Papa refuses any incriminations on their account, and knows no commiseration in his heart for their sorrowful woes, for he cares not for their lives and values them not. I think a herd of cattle would be of more value to him, for indeed many a miner has lost his life from the explosions in the mine, and many a man has succumbed to a brutal injury, like a loss of a limb or eye, as you well know. I was informed that a fortnight after a widow learns about her husband's tragic demise, that our Papa demands her to leave forthwith with her children after such a tragic grief. How can he have in his heart the hardness of solid rocks, and in his mind the fleece of a sheep? For he perceives not the frightful truth of these grave injustices, which I think only God will bring to his attention on the day of our Lord's reckoning. I met a young lady called Violet, whose husband had passed from an explosion a day ago. Her heart was swollen with grief, and her eyes reddened by tears of her turbulent sorrows. I took it upon myself to find her work and lodgings, to accommodate her family, and her gratitude knew no bounds, for she hugged me without restraint, and my heart quickened in delight. I was pleased to have been of service to the poor woman, upon whom my soul surely grieves, for indeed her sorry most wretched plight I would not wish upon any man. Yet let us not deceive ourselves with thoughts that gladden our hearts, lest we should hear the bitter truth. For Eugenie, it is common here in the mines for souls to indeed be lost, much more so than Papa will ever concede to us. For the astonishing stories I hear of late from those miners' wives are too pitiful for words to express, and they confirm my worst fears of the dreadful casualties in the mine that Papa concealeth from us. So put it in your imagination, Eugenie, for deep consideration and reflection, what I have indeed told you. Another gloomy, restless thought that beats upon my brow and disturbs my peace with feelings of grave concern are for those mules taken into the depths of those dark mines, their bodies burdened by the carts carrying the coal backwards and forwards into the bosom of the mine, with no time to rest their weary legs. For they spend days cloaked in the darkness and the gloom of the mine. How unnatural for the poor mules to succumb to the terrifying explosive sounds of the rumbling mine, and be cushioned from the light of day that quickens their eyes to the perils of physical blindness. Papa cares not for the woeful impediment of the animals, as he cares not for the state of the miners. What I have learnt of late is that all the other mine owners are equally as greedy of gaining wealth, as their crowning glory, at the exploitation of the miners that work for them. It is in my understanding that they all have their own company stores and in-house currencies, much like Papa does, and they care not for anyone apart from their pocketbooks, increasing in weight, and some indeed are worse than Papa, if that were indeed possible, in their ravenous pursuit of this goal. I instructed the miners to tell my father that 3 of the mules had lost air in the mine shaft and had indeed suffocated, and that was when I took the mules to a farmer's field, where I paid them handsomely to take care of the animals for the rest of their days. Upon my visit to the mules a few days later did I discover joy in their eyes as the sun beat upon their bodies, and they rolled and frolicked in the field, and their happiness was beyond measure. So grateful were they to be away from such a harrowing job, which no animal should have to endure. It is my decision that I will ever help every mule that works in those mines. Indeed, after a year of work, I will consider her to have paid her due, and to be set free and from her hardened labour, and of this decision father must never ever be informed or enlightened. I've recently been courted by the Phillips boy Matthew, as I imagine you still expected to be the case. He has a heart on him as hard as Papa's is, as his soul is so intent on the pursuit of rich pickings, which seems to be a common goal among all the men I meet. I was to learn this with deep regret when I suggested we went on a picnic together to the wooded area near the ridge where the crooked oak tree stands, opposite the meandering stream, on the right-hand side of the valley. You know the one where we played hide-and-seek as children. It was a pleasing picnic, but I think less to his liking than mine, for the cloth I spread upon the ground was rather too uncomfortable for his soft derriere to abide. It would seem in his lavish cushioned lifestyle he has only ever graced the seat of upholstered chairs, and sitting on the ground was not in agreement with his awkward vertical stature. Even so, he held his countenance in a pleasing and agreeable manner, and hid his displeasure from me, proving to be a gentleman of sorts. We sat and ate our fill, and the meal was pleasing to his appetite. While we were eating under the large oak tree in the woods, it came upon my attention that we were indeed not alone, for I felt with certainty that we were being stared at, but I could see no one in sight. I was also quick to note that Matthew's countenance had taken on a pale pallor, and he had grown exceedingly anxious. He pretended all was well, but even his laughter seemed to have subsided, and became anguished and painfully disturbed, and his attention was far from me, as his eyes regarded the trees with a fearful repose. It was then that I saw a creature that was unlike anything that I've ever seen in all my born days, for never have I seen a creature so strange grace my life before, with the surprise of note. For although the creature looked like a man, it was not a man, and yet it was not an animal either. What it was, I cannot fathom. A giant it was indeed, and colossal in its girth and its size and stature, and it was hefty in its weight. Like a bear, the body was covered in hair, but textured not like that of a bear, but more human-like in its origins. It was a favourable golden colour that was pleasing to the eye. Its face grew no hair, and was of a grey leather, and its nose and jaw were much like yours and mine. But the ridge on its forehead was prominent and furrowed with a great depth. His head was not of human shape, but more like that of an egg, pointed on top, and at the bottom wider in dimension, to be sure. I noted with a keen interest that the head indeed flowed into the shoulders, where no neck was visible. The creature had arms that were so long he could have almost touched his toes, and his feet and hands were indeed very large to behold. It was the deep-set eyes that were so bright and gold that had my attention ordered, for what I was seeing did amplify my awe, and my fascination was indeed aroused. The creature stepped forward out of the shadows into the light, and his reticent shyness was now of the past, for he regarded us with an equal interest. It would seem that Matthew was filled with panic as he began to shake in terror, and I did behold his eyes were round with fright, and his body wobbled like a blamage. In that moment he knew no regard for me, and a gentleman he most certainly was not, for he ran away as fast as the lions upon the mountain, and he screamed with a shrillness that was deafening to the ear. I was left alone, standing close to this strange creature I knew not. But I felt no fear, for it was not unkindly disposed towards me, but more playful in its demeanour and approach. The expression upon his face was that of mischief. It glided towards my picnic that lay upon the ground, and rifled through all the food in the wicker basket, with an eagerness that was comical, for the creature was indeed of great humour. It found the fruit and ate with great delight, and the stewed peaches and strawberries gladdened his heart, and the rich fruit cake was his prize, for that he ate with gusto. The creature put the empty wicker basket upon his head, and so funny was the look that my laughter could not subside, and he seemed pleased by my pleasure, for I believe a natural comic he was born to be. I liked him more than words can express, for he warmed the cockles of my heart like no other, apart from you, Eugenie dear. He then bolted away for a moment and came back, and in my hand he placed a stone, so pretty in its colour, as it had hints of turquoise and gold in its depths. He looked into my eyes as he gave me this gift, and I shall not forget his kindness. In the distance the voices of men were heard, armed with rifles, for indeed Matthew had told them that I was surely dead, ravaged by a wild animal, hungry for my blood. And yet he had run away, leaving me to die. So a gentleman he most certainly was not. I told the men the creature had been dealt with, and that I was fine, and they believed my false report, for I wanted to protect the animal at every cost. Matthew was pleased to see me alive, and indeed asked my papa for permission to marry me. But I told papa that a cowardly man I must surely refuse, and papa did not disagree with my persuasions, which was for me a great relief. I had thought he would press upon me heavily to marry Matthew, but he didn't, I am glad to say. So, Eugenie dear, I will not be betrothed to Matthew, as you believed I would. I have seen him in a brand new light. But do not be disheartened, sister dear, for the time will come when I find the right suitor for me. I am sorry to unload these burdens of mine upon your ears, but I wanted to share with you my grievances, for you, I know, will surely understand the issues of the mine that have long concerned us. Please pray for the miners at the mine, and their wives, of course, and that papa will be more lenient towards them. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Christopher, although sometimes I get called Chris by my friends. Ever since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, I've been wrapped up in the funeral business, as both my parents run a funeral home here in North America, and like it or not, it invariably becomes part of your life. So growing up, seeing dead bodies became almost as natural and normal to me as breathing. I grew up in a rural part of North America, and our funeral home was an extension of our very own large colonial mansion, with an architecture which I think was rather complimentary and becoming, because that rather lends itself well to the funeral business, as it's smart, classy, conservative, yet classical all at the same time. One part of our colonial mansion was used for the funeral business, which had its own very smart, formal front entranceway with palatial-looking arched colonnades and stylized columns that led to a very large blue front door. All this was complemented by an exquisite fountain and a very pretty manicured yard, filled with colourful flowers and exquisite pink and white roses. There was also a large paved driveway and an extensive vertical parking area that was shaded by some very impressive-looking statuesque oak trees. This area was regularly accessed by all our clients, and the funeral vans invariably carrying all the bodies of the recently deceased to transfer to our on-site morgue, or as my father liked to say, our specialised cold room. On the right-hand side of our mansion was another driveway and a small parking bay with a scattering of younger-looking oak trees. There was also an arched colonnade and columns that led to a bright pink front door, which was the living quarters of our residential home, and it was open plan and very spacious, with all our bedrooms on the upstairs elevation. Yet the great thing about the residential side of our property was that there was an inside door that conveniently accessed the funeral parlour from within, serving as a useful functionality for the effectiveness of running our business. When you're dealing with dead bodies being delivered to your premises all the time, it can literally be at any time of the day or night, so you need to be on call almost all of the time, which is why in our family business we do not rarely get a single day off. Somehow you have to make it compatible with your life, and fortunately for us it works well. The funeral business has been a generational business in our family line, going back to the 1900s on my dad's side of the family. When we're out on social occasions and events, people ask us often what we do for a living. My father will just say that we have a counselling business, because if you actually tell people you run a funeral home, people sometimes have no idea how to react and always look incredibly awkward and uncomfortable. It would seem that the uncomfortable subject of death is like the proverbial elephant in the room that no one ever wants to discuss and chooses to eagerly avoid at every cost. One advantage of growing up around death is that it truly makes you appreciate life all the more, because it heightens your awareness that we're not here forever. Believe me, I've seen all ages, all sizes and shapes, and all manner of deaths come through our doors, so nothing surprises me these days, and I'm profoundly aware that one day you might be here, and the next day might be your last, which for me is a very sobering thought, and is not something I take lightly. I guess if it's done anything for me, it's made me value and appreciate my life so much more, and if anything, that's got to be a good thing. Growing up, I had a very idyllic childhood because we lived in an exquisite part of the world, surrounded by ravishing statuesque mountains, rolling green hills, silvery sparkling lakes, lily-covered ponds, and exquisite pasture land, not to mention acres of dreamy forest. You might be surprised that we had all these idyllic surroundings at a funeral parlour, but we did. As kids, playing in the woods was one of our favourite pastimes, and I just adored this shaded retreat, because for me it was like entering our own enchanting, magical little world, which seemingly just belonged to us, although of course that wasn't the truth. The trees in the wooded area on our land had been there for hundreds of years, and they are utterly magnificent, with colossal trunks that literally tower into the sky like masterful giants. The ground is covered in green ferns, flowering shade-loving plants, and lots of rambling green foliage, and the icing of the cake is a gurgling stream that literally zigzags through the forest. We are so blessed to have rock pools and waterfalls that cascade from high rocky elevations and create all those foaming bubbles and refreshing spray. As kids, my brother Simon and I would spend ages playing by the stream, swimming in the rocky pools, throwing pebbles in the water, and sometimes we'd watch the white-tailed deers coming to the stream to drink. Our deer were so much less timid, reticent or shy than is normally the case with these wild deer. But I think it may have something to do with the fact that there has been no hunting on our land for many generations. My mother has always given our deer all our orchard apples in season, so they probably don't see us as predators. We have some specimen of deer with sizable racks that would be any hunter's dream, but they will never ever end up on someone's dinner plate, because my mother would make sure of that. Although my mother would never admit it, she has a huge soft spot for those white tails, and their serene, gentle natures seem to have touched the cockles of her heart. One day when Simon and I were swimming in the rock pool on our land, we saw a strange elderly man wandering around our woods, and he had a vague, ambivalent expression of confusion on his face. Simon and I weren't afraid of this man, because he looked so desperately lost, very disorientated, and exceptionally muddled. At first I thought that he was just a visitor to our funeral home, and had somehow ended up misplaced in the woods, rather than at the reception desk. "Sir," I asked, "are you all right?" "I'm not sure," he told me. "I don't know where I am." "I think you've lost your way," I told the man. "This is the premises of a funeral home. I can take you to the reception if you like." The man seemed even more muddled. "Funeral home," he said. "What am I doing at a funeral home? Why would I be here?" "I'm not sure," I said. "Perhaps someone you know has died. Can you possibly remember?" "I can't remember anything," the man told me. "My mind is a complete blank." "I think I should take you to the reception, sir," I told him. "They might be able to help you find your bearings. Why don't you follow me?" The man obediently followed my brother and I to the reception, but when we turned around to introduce him to the lady behind the reception desk, we discovered to our utter amazement that he had mysteriously just vanished, seemingly into thin air. We didn't know where he'd got to. "What can I do for you boys?" asked Hilda, who was a chubby, cheerful woman who worked in the reception area, and for a funeral home she wore the brightest, most cheerful of coloured clothes, and the warmest smile on her face that would uplift the spirits of the most disheartened of clients. "We were bringing the old man we saw wandering around in the woods to reception," I said. "He seemed very confused, but for some reason he's mysteriously just disappeared. He was here only a moment ago." "I wish I could help you boys," said Hilda, but I don't see anyone with you. Maybe he's wandering around the grounds. Perhaps he has a touch of dementia, but I can't say I was expecting any visitors today." She said this, scanning her diary. "No, we're not anticipating any appointments for the next couple of hours," she assured me. My brother and I searched our premises thoroughly for the strange, rather curious elderly man on the grounds, but we couldn't find him anywhere, and feeling somewhat bemused and befuddled, we dismissed the whole outlandish incident out of hand. It was one of those rather strange idiosyncrasies, but it was soon forgotten, as our minds were soon distracted by much more interesting things. It was only later that I woke up in the middle of the night that I noticed the old man that I'd seen earlier on in the day was now sitting on the end of my bed. Now this was seriously freakish. I couldn't make any sense of what he was doing in my bedroom, or sitting at the end of my bed for that matter. It was all rather unnatural and extraordinaire, but I'm glad to admit that I didn't feel any fear. You see, I felt somewhat familiar with the old man, and also sorry for him. "Excuse me, sir," I said, "but what are you doing in my bedroom at this time of night? We searched for you all afternoon. We couldn't find you anywhere." The old man looked at me with a mystified look on his face, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. "I don't know where I am," he told me again. "I told you. You're in my bedroom," I said. "You don't live in this house. Maybe you should go downstairs and speak to my father. He runs the funeral parlour. He could possibly help you." I reached out to reassure the man, who seemed as solid as you and I are, but when I put my hand on his shoulders, my hand went right through him, as if he was a hologram. I looked at him with an astonished look on my face, and I felt rather startled. "Oh, my goodness," I said. "I think you're dead." "I'm dead?" he said, looking at me with a baffled expression on his face. "If I'm dead, how is it that you can see me?" "I cannot answer that question," I told him. "You're like a hologram, because my hand goes right through you. You must be a ghost." "If I'm dead, aren't I supposed to go somewhere?" he said, looking at me. "Like heaven or something?" "I would have thought so," I said. "I wish I knew how to help you." "Why don't you pray for help? If you ask me, that would be the wisest thing to do, given how peculiar these circumstances are." The man suddenly closed his eyes, and I saw him pray as he moved his mouth. And the next thing I knew was that the most beautiful white ball of light literally bounced into the bedroom, and then the old man just vanished before my eyes, and then there were suddenly two balls of light that glided through our ceiling and were finally gone. It was in that moment I felt assured that he had found the help that he was actually looking for. I must say that event really disturbed me, because this man that appeared to my brother and I seemed to be flesh and blood, but he was without question a ghost. I think he appeared to us rather like a hologram, because that is the only way I can describe it. The poor man was so muddled and confused, and didn't even know he was dead, but we didn't for that matter either. That has got to be very frightening. I was to discover that the elderly man that I'd met was actually in cold storage on our premises, and had suffered from advanced Alzheimer's later on in life, and he couldn't even remember his own name. It would seem that even in death he was confused and rather muddled. When I told my dad the extraordinary story, he believed my strange account, as I gathered that he'd also experienced a full-bodied apparition once that was solidly as real as you and I are. He revealed to me that on one occasion when he was driving the funeral van, that the deceased woman who was lying on the gurney in the back of the van suddenly appeared on the seat next to him. He said he nearly fainted because she was so real, but he recognised her immediately from the corpse he'd picked up from the retirement home. I gather he'd wrapped her up and covered the deceased body himself. The dead woman turned to my dad and said, "I'm going now, they're waiting for me," and vanished before his eyes. He said when he got home he had to settle his nerves with several tots of brandy to give him some Dutch courage, because he couldn't believe what he'd actually seen. It would seem that many of the caretakers and people working in our funeral home have had some rather strange paranormal experiences themselves. Hilda, the receptionist, said she had her bum pinched and turned around and no one was there. Then she heard this creepy chuckle and she ran out of the home and drove straight back to her house, refusing to come back to work for many days. We found out later that one of the deceased men we had in our cold storage had a very nasty habit of pinching women's backsides because he loved the vast range of reactions he would get from them. Most of them were far from pleased. My mother once came down to answer the front door of the funeral home section in the middle of the night as someone was rapping very hard at the front door. My mother was irritated because the person was very persistent and wouldn't stop. My dad was picking up a dead body at the time and unfortunately was not at home. When my mother opened the front door, there was no one standing there, but she said someone was definitely smoking this very pungent tobacco, and the smoke was actually blowing in her face, and she could see the spirals of smoke physically before her eyes, but she saw no one standing there. My mother said that she could feel the presence of a very distinguished, stylish gentleman. Even though she couldn't physically see him, she did sense that he was very stylish. A day after this event, we had a client requesting that several King of Denmark cigars should be put in her husband's coffin, because in life he had smoked the finest, most costly cigars, and she said he was always dressed in the swankiest Valentino suits and Louis Vuitton shoes. My mother was very certain that this was the apparition of the zooty man who had pounded on her front door. As bizarre and preposterous as this may sound, every single day while he was actually in cold storage, that entire room reeked of cigar smoke, until the gentleman was actually finally buried, and then the smoke vanished. Over the years we've had very strange experiences, like hearing loud plodding footsteps during the night, or seeing doors opening and closing on their own accord, which still sometimes happens. We've had one occasion when a dead body was delivered to our mortuary and actually woke up in cold storage screaming. I gather the hospital falsely believed that the poor woman was actually dead, but she'd obviously been in an unconscious state, and her pulse and heartbeat had not been detectable. I'll never forget those screams as long as I live, because they were the most terrifying sounds that I've ever heard in my life. It was so piercingly shrill that it woke up our entire household. We all rushed to the mortuary as fast as we could and flung open the sliding fridge door where the screams emanated from. The petrified woman had ripped off the wrappings on her ghostly pale face and stared at us with wide, terrified eyes. And then she said, "What the hell am I doing here? I'm freezing to death in this place. Who brought me here?" Luckily, she was actually reunited with her husband, who became like an excitable, uncontrollable puppy dog when he discovered that his wife was actually alive. I remember him tapping his cell phone non-stop, informing the entire world that his wife had risen from the dead, and you could hear the rapturous applauses on the other end of the phone. "Maria's alive! Maria's alive! It's a miracle!" The wife was far from amused, because I don't think she ever got over spending some lonesome time in a mortuary with a bunch of dead bodies. As you can imagine, my father was incredibly embarrassed about this incident and always likes to make very sure that the corpse is in fact deceased, without just taking the hospital's word for it, because he said this could never ever happen again, because it might ruin our business. One day when I was about 15 years old and Simon was about 16, we were hanging out on the flattened rocks around the rock pool, watching the water cascading over the rocks and talking. That was when we suddenly heard a very peculiar sound. The only way I can describe it to you is it sounded like two people were having an argument, and the voices were very elevated in a way that would be if you were shouting at someone, only the tone of voice and frequency was very different. It sounded like a foreign language was being spoken. Simon whispered me to follow him, and we both crept silently towards the raised voices, and the closer we got, the more bizarre the sound of the strange, curious language. As we crept ever closer, we saw two massive creatures, which at first glance appeared to be bears, but as we looked ever closer, they were anything but. It was in that moment that I had a mind-blowing revelation that these strange creatures were in fact Bigfoots. As you might expect, they were Herculean in size and were easily over 8 foot tall, 4 foot wide and 700 pounds, and they were covered in long flowing hazelnut hair. The thing that struck me as phenomenal was just how huge these creatures actually were. Every part of their body was sinewy and muscular, and they were powerful and strong, and the shoulders on these creatures were expansive and very defined. I never noticed a neck, as the cone-shaped head appeared to flow seamlessly into the shoulders. My brother and I watched in awe as these colossal creatures seemed to continue arguing about something, although what it was I could not imagine. The more cross they became, the more high-pitched and faster their chattering. The creatures were not fighting physically, but they were using this chattering conversation to express their extreme indignation. Very suddenly I heard this thunderous sound, and the only way I can describe it to you is it sounded like a rhino barging through the thicket at an excessive speed. Whatever was racing towards us had to be monumental in size. It was a very haunting and unsettling sound, a sound I shall never forget. Then I saw him. I nearly fainted in shock, because this creature quite literally dwarfed the 8-footers. He was easily over 11 foot tall and 1,000 pounds. I noticed that quite suddenly the two critters who had been fighting stopped chattering and were very quiet and composed. The large Bigfoot looked at them with an intense, furious gaze, almost as if he knew that they had both been fighting. It was obvious that the wool couldn't be pulled over his eyes, as he had definitely ascertained that his offspring had been very naughty, and he was clearly far from impressed. The two young Bigfoots looked incredibly guilty, and they hung their heads in shame, almost as if they'd been told off for behaving badly. It was in that moment that I thought the big critter might be the father, and the two male Bigfoots twins, because they looked remarkably alike, although not 100% identical. The big male stormed over to the one Bigfoot and tapped his clenched hand, and the Bigfoot obediently opened his palm. There in the middle of his hand was a large pearly white marble. I immediately recognised this pretty marble as one that my brother and I had lost when we were playing marbles in the woods recently. The huge commotion in the woods was all over this white marble of ours. The big alpha male banged the marble against the tree and broke it into 2 pieces, giving each twin half a marble. And suddenly both the Bigfoots became incredibly happy, as if their father had resolved their big problem for them, and they both started to play with half a marble. I realised that even though these Bigfoots were very tall, they must have been remarkably young. I noticed that they had a huge amount of respect for their father, and I was very impressed that their argument didn't actually lead into a physical fight. I have to admit Simon and I could have learnt from those Bigfoots, because growing up we have had quite a few physical altercations that involved a few punches and hair-pulling that I'm ashamed to admit about. We finally watched the father and sons gliding back into the forest with a seamless grace that literally boggles the mind. Simon and I were over the moon that we'd actually seen Bigfoots that day. We rushed into the mortuary to tell everybody the miracle that we had actually seen in the woods. We were so surprised that some people were convinced that we'd seen a bear. I realised then and there that not everybody believes in the hairy critters, but Simon and I are in no doubt what we saw. My brother and I brought 2 bags of identical marbles and hung them up on the tree for the young Bigfoots, because we don't want them fighting again, and I believe they received them because the very next day they were gone. I can't imagine how elated they must have been with the present. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.